Hi, everybody. After yesterday's deep topic about something pretty far away from home, I thought today we'd talk about something a little bit closer to home. So, in 1995, our country nearly split up. I was 12 when all this happened, so I kind of knew what was happening, but I didn't really know why or how, it was something happening in front of me. So, today I want to talk about the origins of why there was a referendum in 1995 and what that would have meant for us as Canadians if it went the other way. So on October 30th, 1995, 4.7 million people went to vote in the province of Quebec, with 2.30 voting yes and 2.36 voting no. So percentage-wise, only 50.58% of votes were against Quebec separation. So it was close, like really close. So how did they get to this point? Well, one of the tricky things when discussing history is like, where do you start? And when it comes to an issue of the desires in Quebec for separation or sovereignty, and you'll use those two terms fairly interchangeably. So sovereignty, independence, it's the same thing. So generally in Canada, you're split between the federalists, which are people that want to keep Canada together, and the sovereigntists, which are people that want to break Canada up and have an independent Quebec. So it goes back to the end of New France, when, General Montcalm was defeated on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. But that's the tricky place to start. We're not going to start in the 1700s. And then we can easily start again the 1960s and the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. So society was considerably different in the 1950s, leading up to the election of Jean Lesage as premier. So people were pretty dominated from a couple of different aspects. So the Union Nationale was the party in place, and it was a very conservative party in the terms of there's not a lot of change going on. Not a lot of new agendas are being pushed. It's very much a status quo situation with that government. It's a heavily Catholic society, and the church has a huge influence on everybody. And another quirk is in a province like Quebec, where, it's predominantly Francophone or French. Business and finance was controlled by the English. So up until the 60s, generally what it was English people were the bosses and the French people did the work. So the opportunities weren't necessarily in line with, the majority of the population. So Jean Lesage did a lot of work with his Liberal government to change institutions. So things like nationalization of certain areas like electricity to Hydro-Quebec. The introduction of new secular schools and a program called Cégep, which is like a junior college. So you finish your grade 11 and then you do 2 years at Cégep. Cégep would be, for people going to university, it would kind of be like your grade 12 and first year university, and then you do 3 years of university. Otherwise, if you're going into the trades, it's like, instead of doing grade 12, you start your welding course. And by the time you've finished your first year of university by our age standards, you've got your trade and you're ready to enter the workforce. So those are some of the things that Jean Lesage does. Still doesn't quite protect in the sense of the English versus French sort of thing. So the two solitudes, as it's referred to. So new laws come later about signage. So you could have a sign completely in English outside of your business, and that was legal. the laws to protect the French language, Bill 101, essentially said your signs can't be in English, they have to be in French. And a lot of weird things come out of that. I mean, the idea that, like, can you use the word spaghetti? Because it's not a French word, it's an Italian word. So, like, there's, like, every so often something comes up in the news and it's, like, just some nonsense around French language sign laws. But essentially, you can't have James's auto body as being on your sign. It has to be in French. And you're allowed to have a small percentage that's English. And really, that's just in certain areas which are predominantly Anglophone. Because when you look at the population of Quebec, I mean, it's French everywhere and large pockets of English in certain areas. So you're going to hear English spoken in, like, the west end of Montreal and, the greater Montreal area, or in the Ottawa Valley in, like, Gatineau Hall. There's a lot of English-speaking people there. But Quebec City, the Eastern Townships, the Abitibi, and Lac Saint Jean, when you get up to, like, Chicoutimi, Saguenay area, it's predominant, not even predominantly, it's like 95 to 100% Francophone. So in 1976, the people of Quebec elect the Parti Québécois for the first time under René Lévesque. And his vision is a separate Quebec. They've already done all this institution building within the province, and his vision is, let's finish this deal. So in 1980 is the first referendum, and it's a fairly dominant no vote on that. So it's set aside for a while. There's no real interest in necessarily sovereignty. Sure, people in Quebec want to have their uniqueness recognized, and there are certain areas of their life that it's, it is different than English Canada. Because, I mean, if any of you have traveled, being in Montreal, being in Quebec City, it's different. When you travel to Alberta or British Columbia, you still feel, it's still English Canada. The storefronts are different, the attitudes are different, everything's different in Quebec. I think it's a great part of what makes Canada a unique and wonderful country. So, in 1981, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so Justin's dad, and the premiers come together because they want to work on the Constitution of Canada. So that's, like, the underlying legal document that sort of makes Canada what it is. Because, we use the number 1867 as, like, the Confederation of Canada, but that's not really when Canada became a country. That's just when a bunch of colonies were put together into a colony of Canada. So Treaty of Westminster, 1932, is effectively when the British Crown hands over everything to Ottawa and says, okay, you guys can handle all your internal and foreign affairs. So really, that's when independence happens. It's a soft number there. It's not like it's a firm number like in a lot of countries. It's like, here's your independence. It wasn't like that in Canada. True independence probably doesn't come until 1982, when our Constitution is repatriated, or we come up with our own Constitution, it's signed off by the British Crown, and it's ours now. So in 81, Trudeau and all the premiers come this close to having that really good deal that works for everyone. But then at the end, it doesn't work for René Lévesque, and he doesn't sign off on it. So every province signs off on the new Constitution. The Constitution Act brings the Constitution back to Canada, but Quebec's not signed to it. So let's move forward a couple of years. So Brian Mulroney was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. So would be what's just known as the Conservative Party today. He wants to build a new coalition of people. So he's trying to bring all these different people together so he can provide a strong majority government. And a big part of what he does is he recruits nationalists, so people that are sort of Quebec first, Canada second, to be a part of his group. So he wins a lot of seats in Quebec, and it's generally the Liberal Party wins a lot of seats in Quebec. And one thing that Mulroney wants to do is get Quebec on board with the Constitution. So in 1987, there's a big meeting called the Meech Lake meetings. So Meech Lake is just outside of Ottawa. I'm 5, like I don't understand what's going on, but I know when like Dad had the radio on every day, like today it's coronavirus this, coronavirus that, then it was Meech Lake this, Meech Lake that. And I would have thought Meech Lake was like the size of Lake Superior for the amount of time that this lake is being talked about. But really the lake's irrelevant. It's just there's like a clubhouse there where everyone gets together. It's just because it's close to Ottawa. So I don't know. It still seems like this big place to me. Anyhow, they work hard for a week and they come up with some amendments to the Constitution that would bring Quebec on board. So what those amendments were, the key points to it, when there's some stuff that's kind of neither here nor there, it's not too exciting with how senators and Supreme Court justices are going to be determined. You know, it's the big thing that comes out of this is Quebec wants to be recognized as a distinct society within the Constitution. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it's a kind of vague term, but what it means is how do you recognize that Quebec is a different place within the Constitution? So it's a reference to their laws, because they're in a different legal system, their language, it's French, their culture. It's a unique culture. So this gets put into this accord, and all the provinces sign off on it at a time. But each province has to have a vote within their own legislatures to decide if they go forward with it. So in Quebec, it's signed off right away. And that sets a call for clock. You have 2 years for everybody else across the country to sign off on it. And provinces start to tick off the list. And they all agree. But the problem is, good old democracy, there's provincial elections in the meantime. So you're fighting a provincial election, and this might be something that comes up as a main talking point, because it wasn't super popular in Manitoba. There were a lot of concerns in New Brunswick. It wasn't super popular in Newfoundland. So naturally, all those 3 provinces have provincial elections. New Brunswick eventually signs on. So Frank McKenna gets elected. His party wins every single seat in New Brunswick. It's pretty crazy. Like, there's no opposition. So he just wants to make sure, like, hey, if we're talking about distinct society for Quebec, let's make sure like minority language rights in other provinces are protected as well. I.e., New Brunswick makes sense. I mean, it's like 20% French. So like that's no one's really. It's not that McKenna is like, Beach Lake is bad. It's like, yeah, can we just tweak it a little bit to make it a little bit New Brunswickier? Because we don't usually make things New Brunswickier, I guess. Manitoba was not particularly happy with it. They had their own issues with their provincial election where there was a lot of chefs in the kitchen there. So Mulroney works hard to try to get everyone on board. Everybody's trying to get everybody on board. And it comes down to the last day. And Newfoundland says no. They decide not to put it to a vote. Same thing happens in Manitoba. So Meech Lake dies. So you can imagine that the spirit in Quebec is like, we found some things that could make this really work for us and really solidify the country, but you English people don't seem to want it. So they go back to the drawing board. And they take a lot of the key concepts that were in the Meech Lake, and some new things are added in, because there's a lot of Indigenous concerns around Indigenous self-government and whatnot that weren't really being addressed by Meech Lake. So August 1992, in Charlottetown, they come up with sort of a fresh new version of Meech Lake. So it's essentially Meech Lake with a couple of tweaks to include things for, status of women, status of Indigenous peoples. So, because some laws have changed in provinces, now this isn't just decided by the legislatures anymore. It's a national referendum. So a referendum it's a vote where everybody in the country says yes or no to something. And these don't happen very often. Generally, in our constitutional democracy, we elect our elected officials to make these decisions. We don't elect people to have an additional vote on everything every time, because that's why we brought people in. In other jurisdictions, like in the United States and Switzerland, there's a lot of referendums and there's a lot of things where you're voting on particular issues. So, like for example, like a lot of states had their own votes on whether or not same-sex marriage was going to be legal. In Canada, it was just decided. So, it goes to a national referendum, and everyone across the country gets to vote. And the Liberal Party is saying, you should vote yes. The Conservative Party, in power, not super popular, they're saying, hey, everybody, vote yes. The NDP, large left-wing party, is telling everybody, you should vote yes. The premiers of every province are saying, hey, vote yes. The media is saying, in our opinion, you ought to vote yes. What do Canadians do? They vote no. So they're not comfortable with it. A lot of people aren't comfortable with the idea of distinct society. They don't like the idea that one province has something special about them compared to any of the other provinces. So, you can say, Newfoundland definitely has a distinct society versus any other areas. Nova Scotia is a different place than Ontario. People in Toronto have a different lifestyle and society than people in Brandon, Manitoba. And that's one of the overarching things that come out of it. And this vote, it's not like it was close. So nationwide, it's 54% no, 45% yes. So that's a pretty firm rebuke against what's going on there. So naturally, people in Quebec, they're not super pleased, because they ended up voting no as well, but now people in Quebec are feeling like they're not being respected. It's not, their society isn't being recognized, and there's definitely a higher interest in saying, look, we tried twice. We wanted to make this work. We did couples counseling. Maybe it's time for divorce. So the 1993 federal election rolls around, and it's an earth-shattering result. So the Conservative Party had been in first place. They'd been in charge for a long time. They get decimated, just destroyed in the election. Who becomes the opposition to the Liberal Party? Sovereigntist Bloc Québécois Party under Lucien Bouchard. Who's the second in the number 3 party? The Reform Party, essentially the Conservative Party, a bit further to the right and strongly in Western Canada. And their rhetoric, their language isn't exactly touchy-feely when it comes to Quebec. Next thing that happens is there's a provincial election in Quebec, and the Parti Québécois, which René Lévesque's old party, now led by Jacques Parizeau, they win the election there. So there's a lot of things kind of adding up, being like, there's gonna be another referendum coming up. People in Quebec are this is getting ugly. This isn't going to be good. Like no good's coming out of this right now. So 1995, there's an agreement between Parti Québécois, the provincial party, their federal counterparts, the Bloc Québécois, and a small party called Action Démocratique de Québec, which is sort of a soft nationalist party, a bit further to the right when it comes to like fiscal conservatism. They decide, and this is what we want our question to be for something called sovereignty association, whatever that is actually supposed to be. Because we'll talk about in a second, that's a pretty fuzzy term. So they decide that in October of 1995, there's going to be a referendum. A vote for yes is a vote for sovereignty association, or essentially what Parizeau says later on, independence. Or vote no is, no, let's stay together. Let's stay together as Canada. And it starts off, the no's are in the lead. Not a great argument's being made yet. Jacques Parizeau is kind of stumbling, leading this referendum. And towards the middle of the campaign, there's a changeover. So while Parizeau is the Premier of Quebec, the more popular politician is Lucien Bouchard. So he'd been in Mulroney's cabinet. He's the one that started the Bloc Québécois. And at the end of 1994, he became a considerably more sympathetic figure across the country, and particularly in Quebec, because he actually lost his leg to flesh-eating bacteria. Pretty crazy. So he's like seen as like not just like a fighter for Quebec, but he's like a fighter in life. And it's like, you got to respect the guy. You may not agree with, Quebec independence, but you're still like, man, dude's a fighter. So he takes over the control over what this campaign is going to look like. And then it starts to turn. And he's really effective. And polls are saying, oh, it's going to be close. Oh, it's close with yes in the lead. So, one thing that happens days before the referendum, 1 million people in a rally for Canada come together in downtown Montreal. And there's music, and it's a big party, essentially being like people across the country all coming to Montreal, pretty much saying, you guys are important. My Canada includes Quebec. Please say no to this. Like there were busloads of people going up from Ontario. They had Air Canada slashed airfares to fly to Montreal so you could go to this. Is it what turned the vote? I don't know. But when it came down to actual voting time, luckily for all of us, it was a narrow no victory. So perhaps people were just kind of scared off at the end. It's like, you get really excited about something. You think, I'm all about this. And then you think more and more of what that actually means. And it's like, I'm kind of scared of that. Like some of you might be like, man, I really want to leave home for university. I really want to go away. Maybe I want to go to London and go to school there. And as it gets closer, you feel like, whoa, this is a bit more than I'm really anticipating. Maybe I'll just go to SMU or Dal. Go to Dal. Or Concordia. It's Montreal, great city. So it's close. And what it comes down to is if you look at a map of how Quebec voted in 1995, it's heavily along the St. Lawrence River. So there's a term referred to as like pure laine Québécois or like pure wool Quebecer. This would be the long-term the descendants of the settlers of New France, the colonists of New France. The areas that voted strongly no would be the greater Montreal area. Now, there's pockets in Montreal that would be heavily sovereigntist and heavily federalist. So when you take a look at that island as a whole, the West Island, so like where the airport is, it's pretty English up that way. Those are the English suburbs. So those areas would be voting 95% no. When you look at a riding, so when I lived in Montreal, and I lived in a neighborhood called Rosemont, which is a bit more of a working class, it's a francophone neighborhood. Amazing neighborhood, love Rosemont. But it would have voted probably 85% yes. So the yes votes come mostly from these Pure Latin Québécois. When you look at a group called allophones, so those would be people that moved to Quebec that are not English or French. So an allophone would be someone that moved to Quebec from Japan or any other country. The allophone vote was predominantly no. The Indigenous vote was predominantly no. So it raised questions afterwards, because it's all well and good that it ended up being no, so you maintain some form of status quo or some form of normalcy. But what if it was a yes vote? And this is sort of one of those great what if questions in Canadian history. So if it is a yes, and Quebec can separate from Canada, well, then could areas of Quebec separate from Quebec? That was the argument that was being made by Cree and Inuit leaders who voted predominantly, like 98% no. And that's half the province in geographic terms. So they didn't want to be a part of that. Could the island of Montreal, which again is very heavily split on, in the east is francophone, predominantly nationalist, in the west is anglophone, entirely federalist, is Montreal divisible? Again, it doesn't actually come up, but it's one of those interesting debates that both sides would argue both ways. So what would have happened if there was a yes vote? Right away, there probably would have been a declaration of independence. From everything I've read about what would have happened in the aftermath of a yes vote, despite the question being formed in such a way, and it's a very complicated question, it was going to be some level of, we want to negotiate with Canada for, increased control over certain things, but there wouldn't be national border. Like, it's when you wouldn't have to go through customs when you're going through New Brunswick into Quebec, and they want to still use Canadian currency, but they'd have their own foreign policy, and it was kind of complicated of what this actually would look like. But if they declared independence right away, well, that would have gone through the courts. Would it be legal? We're all glad that it didn't happen. But it was scary times for the country. What has changed since 1995? Because, yeah, the Bloc Québécois had a big resurgence in the last federal election, but they're not really talking referendum. Well, a lot of work was done to increase the visibility of Canada within Quebec. So there's a lot of things that are being sponsored and by the federal government. Did that make a difference? I don't know, maybe. I know when I moved to Montreal and I'd go to a ball game or a hockey game or something, when the national anthem was played, about half the people stayed seated. People did not stand for the anthem. It was disorienting for me because that's what you do, but that's Quebec. Just slowly, as the fortunes of Montreal improved, because that was a big shock to the province. People, a lot of businesses pulled out. People didn't know if they wanted to do business there. But eventually the economy rebounded and the economy across the province improved. And things have been going well there. In the Harper government, they made a point of recognizing, not necessarily in the Constitution, but that Quebec is a nation within Canada. And I think that was a powerful statement to make. Because it's true, if you want to read what the definition of nation is, it's, a nation isn't necessarily defined by a country's borders. A nation is a distinct group of people with their own culture. So yeah, Quebec's definitely a nation by definition. And that made a big point. And this is me speaking. I mean, I don't have any science to back this up, but I think the 2010 Olympics made a huge difference in Canadian culture. When we hosted those games and the success of our Francophone and Anglophone athletes and everyone pulling together for it, and everyone was so excited for everything that the country was doing and what was going on in the country, it brought us all closer. To see the smile on Alex Bilodeau's face when he won the first Canadian gold on Canadian soil. It was one of those, I think that was a turning point culturally for Canada in making the country stronger. Because since then, I've been to sporting events in Montreal, and pretty much everyone's standing. And it blew my mind watching a Habs game once, and instead of having someone sing the national anthem, it was sung by the entire crowd. There was no way that would have happened in 1997. Not a chance. So to see that being able to be done now, it's pretty neat to see. Will the issue ever go away? Will Quebec's sovereignty ever be firmly put to bed? It seems like it's going to, and then something bubbles up. So will there be another referendum in our lifetime? Honestly, I have no clue. History generally repeats itself. I think that we're in a good place between Canada and Quebec. I think there's going to be some dividing things that come up, but they're not going to be anything more unusual that divide Canadians anyway, when it comes to issues like on pipelines. And, I think we're all on the same page when it comes to, how do we deal with the coronavirus. I think we're doing well in that sense. But anyway, they were scary times. And what would Canada look like right now if Quebec did have independence? I don't know. Would Nova Scotia still be part of Canada? I don't know. Probably, but I don't know. What would it be like to go from, would you still be able to drive, to Toronto from here? Or are you going through customs no matter what? Are we going to be some weird exclave that's disconnected from the rest of our country? What does that mean for us? Luckily, we don't have to know. So I'll find something else to talk about tomorrow. Maybe something a little less complicated, because if you want to find a good divisive topic, talking about Quebec is usually a good one. But in my opinion, Quebec's the heart of our country. I love the province. I love the French language. I love the people of Quebec. It's an amazing place. I lived there for 2 years. It's absolutely fantastic. I wish I was still bilingual. You lose it when you live down in Nova Scotia. But we should continue to be finding things that bring us together as a country and together as a Canadian people, and recognizing that Quebec is just a unique, special, wonderful place. And it's an important part of our country. And if you're meeting people from Quebec, don't make separatist jokes. They don't like them. It's not worth picking that scab. So something else will come tomorrow. I have some ideas. We'll see what I actually come up with. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned something today. Talk about it with your parents. they'll remember a lot of this stuff too. There's a lot of good resources out there if you want to Google some more on it. All right, we'll talk to you later. See ya.